G'day. This is the first of the get up in the night for a pee and can't get back to sleep videos. Don't know whether it'll ultimately be a podcast or Logitech or YouTube or what the hell. But this is the story of Noel and the Mangamahu Hotel and the parrot, sort of. I got to know the last bit of the story because I was directly involved. And I pieced together the early bits by talking to Noel and talking to another mate that I know that was involved in the early days. So, if you drive from Wellington up towards Wanganui and you throw a right before you get there, about 30 miles before you get there, you go up the Mangamahu Valley. And in the old days, before much in the way of roads, and before the railway line that was opened in 1908 between Wellington and Auckland, Mangamahu was right on the main drag, because the coaches used to go up Wellington Wanganui, and that was a dead end. A bit on in Taranaki, but if you went to Auckland, you went Wellington to Wanganui Road, and then you went from up the Mangamahu Valley to what they in those days called Rarahi, but these days it's probably more Raitihi. And the Mangamahu settlement itself was quite big and important because it was a place to overnight and stay and eat and victual and do all that and change your horses, and it was a thriving little township. And in due course, roading improved and the main trunk line went through and Mangamahu became a backwater. And it was the centre of a farming settlement, so there was a general store and post office. There was a pub, a hotel with accommodation, there was a butcher's shop, there were various other bits and pieces, and of course there was a school and a couple of churches. But times changed and farming was different and properties were bigger and the numbers of rural people were smaller. And Mangamahu gradually, well, it didn't die, it just got smaller. And in due course, it just became absolutely ridiculous to have accommodation there in Mangamahu. And a couple, called the Andersons, with a couple of kids, and they were sort of local and connected locally, bought the Mangamahu Hotel. And they turned it into a tavern. They managed to persuade the Licence and Control Commission that accommodation wasn't really needed and what was needed were a place where people could buy booze and drink. So the Licence and Control Commission said okay, and the Andersons made the place into a tavern. So downstairs they had a public bar and a private bar, and upstairs, where they used to have accommodation for the passing travellers, they turned that into accommodation for the owners, the Anderson family. And the house, which was was on the property, but actually physically detached, that the owners of the hotel previously used to occupy, was sold off, and so the Andersons were able to reduce their mortgage and run a tavern. All good. And during the day, there wasn't a lot of custom, and Mrs. Anderson largely looked after the two kids, Noel and Tricia. Noel was probably 18 months and Tricia was maybe 5 at the time. Tricia went to school, Mrs. Anderson looked after Noel during the day. But in the evenings, when things got a bit busy, Mrs. Anderson looked after the private bar, and Mr. Anderson looked after the public bar. And upstairs, behind a little gate that kept kids in or dogs in or what have you, were left Noel and Tricia. And of course the kids had been put to bed or whatever before things hotted up and before Mrs. Anderson went downstairs for 3 hours to 4 hours to look after the private bar and bottle store. And Tricia looked after Noel. To get a picture of how it was, you probably need to be familiar with the Charlie Brown cartoons, the Peanuts cartoons, because Tricia was a dead ringer for Charlie Brown's nemesis, Lucy. And she was doing her best. She was just a kid, but her parenting was, "Watch out, be careful, God, you're stupid, that was dumb, you're silly." And it was very much like that. And so Noel, on a fairly regular basis, was subject to his sister's parenting, for want of a better word. And things went along. And then the Andersons acquired a parrot. Now, exactly how, Barbell perhaps, that's the story. There may have been some other things as well. But they acquired a parrot from a seaman, a local boy who joined the Merchant Navy. And in those days, biosecurity in New Zealand wasn't big. So when he came back home, he brought a parrot with him. They were brightly coloured, and it was a parrot. Unfortunately, the parrot had come from a brothel in Panama. And the parrot said all sorts of things in about 7 languages, most of which let's simply say that they were fairly risque and not really suitable for a public bar. Even a public bar in New Zealand in Mangamahu at the time. Fortunately, most of the people in Mangamahu didn't speak any of the 7 languages. But then the parrot started to swear in New Zealand vernacular. And Mr. Anderson decided he couldn't have that. And so he decided he would teach the parrot not to swear. And he did so every time the parrot swore by plucking out one of the parrot's feathers. And the end result of that, after 4 or 5 weeks, was a semi-bold parrot that flinched any time anybody said fuck in the public bar. Well, the parrot had to go upstairs, and so it did. And after that, the parrot lived upstairs, and it knew that you didn't go downstairs, and downstairs was not a good place to be, so it stayed upstairs. And it took to Noel. Now, those of you who've studied biology will have heard of Conrad Lorenz, the old fascist and Hitler lover who wrote about imprinting ducks, and if you get ducks at the right age and you hang around them, they think that you're their mother and they imprint on you. I don't know much about animal psychology, but it seems like the parrot imprinted on Noel. Noel certainly imprinted on the parrot. The two became inseparable. Some people that said it used to perch on his head and dig its claws into his hair. I don't know about that at the time. What is clear is that the parrot and Noel basically needed each other. You've got this kid, a preschool kid still, who's got to have the parrot and will throw a tantrum if anyone tries to take the parrot away. And you've got a parrot that's had a variety of experiences in the South American jungle, the Central American jungle, or presumably that's where it came from, or perhaps it was bred, in a Panamanian brothel, and then in the bar of the Mangamahu Hotel, and now upstairs, and the parrot's come home, and the parrot's found the meaning and purpose of its life, and it's sticking with Noel. And if you try and take the parrot away from Noel, the parrot claws and screams and bites, and parrots have quite a beak. Anyway, the Andersons, Mr. and Mrs., decided they'd just go with it. They were a bit worried, of course, who wouldn't be? But they thought, well, maybe he'll grow out of it. And maybe he would have. But the parrot started to pick up the things that Tricia used to say to Noel. Watch out, be careful, that's too dangerous. No, you're too little, you can't do that. God, you're stupid. Those sorts of things. And after a while, it was like the parrot had got into Noel's head, and he had to hear those things. At the same time, those things kind of got in the way of his functioning and his proper development. Things carried on very much as things do, until it was time for Noel to go to school. And in New Zealand, most kids start at 5, but don't legally have to start till 6, and the Andersons sort of stretched it out. It was one teacher school, and the teacher was a cousin of Mrs. Anderson's. Rural areas at that time, it wasn't unusual to find a lot of people fairly closely related, one side of the blanket or other. Anyway, single teacher, and so she let Noel bring the parrot to school. One teacher, 20-something kids on a good day, 17 or 18 if there was work to be done on the farms. Anyway, the teacher basically wanted to cover her ass. She didn't want to get into trouble, didn't want to get anyone else into trouble. So she notified the inspectorate, the education department, people who looked at schools, and the whole story about social welfare and education and what have you was a bit different in those days. But Mangamahu was on the end of 30 miles of gravel road, and what the hell were they going to do? What the hell were they going to offer? And, I actually heard this part of the story from a guy who was involved, a district psychologist, who later became a friend of mine. Anyway, he basically let it ride. And so Noel went through his primary schooling with a parrot in the class with him. And nobody, after a while, nobody thought too much about it. And from time to time, the parrot would whisper in his ear, "Watch out, be careful, God, you're stupid, you can't do that." That sort of stuff. And provided Noel had that with the parrot, he was, in a sense, crippled and sort of damaged by having all this shit in his ear. But on the other hand, it also provided a level of security to him that he really needed. And he freaked out whenever he didn't have the parrot. And the parrot freaked out. So separating the two was a bit problematic, and when anybody succeeded, however briefly, Noel was just in total panic. He was totally messed up and couldn't function. One stage I understand that after a couple of days he became catatonic, but that's a different story and I'm not sure how true it is. What I do know, because I heard from my mate, was that eventually it was time for Noel to get on the school bus and go into Wanganui, well, as it is these days, Whanganui, for his secondary education. And parents basically didn't think it was going to work, and Noel didn't think it was going to work, and nobody asked the parrot, but presumably it didn't think it would work either. And Mrs. Anderson's cousin, the teacher of the two teachers, or the one teacher school, said maybe he could leave school, maybe he could stay and do an extra year here, he's a bit behind anyway, and by then he'd be 14 and we could get an exemption from the district senior inspector at the education department. So they did. And Noel left school. He had a job to go to because another of the Andersons' cousins ran a shearing gang. Noel could go with the parrot and start as an assistant shearer's cook for the gang. And some people gave him a bit of shit, but basically people are reasonably good-hearted. And from 14 to 19, Noel was with the gang and they worked around Te Tairāwhiti, the east coast, and shore thousands upon thousands upon thousands of sheep. And Noel gradually became a pretty reasonable shearer's cook, and he worked as a roustabout and handled wool, and I think he was even starting to knock the wool off a few sheep and learning to be a shearer. What the parrot did when he was on the board, I have no idea, but it worked. And then the cousin who owned the gang decided to take the gang to Australia. And for reasons that I'm not very clear about, that probably had to do with psittacosis or Australian biosecurity, there was a hitch about Noel taking the parrot. So he couldn't go, and by now he was 19 and the big city was calling, and he and the parrot went north. They went north to Auckland. And for maybe 3 years, he did stuff in Auckland. Some of the stuff he did had to do with male prostitution and customers who were into kinky stuff, and some of the stuff he did was simply dressing up as a pirate and with a live parrot and children's parties. I think he kept the sex work and the children's parties separate. I certainly hope so. But he would turn up at children's parties with his parrot dressed as a pirate, and it was all right. And at one stage he tried the high silk stovepipe hat. Tried to keep the parrot underneath it, but the parrot didn't like that and would shit in his hair, so that was not tough. It never went anywhere, but he kept the hat, which comes into the story a bit later. Anyway, after 4 years, he was in his early 20s, and he wound up in my office. I was a psychotherapist in Auckland. I called it hypnotherapy in those days, but what I was in fact doing was delving deeply into the psyche of my patients. Called them patients in those days. It was very medical, I tell you. I had rooms and Remuera Road. In the same block, I had an osteopath. He was slightly on edge, as I was as a hypnotherapist, but there was an orthodontist and a periodontist and a radiologist and an internal medicine something or other, or maybe he was a gastric surgeon, but he had rooms there, but we never saw him. Forever Rolls Royce, an old one, but a Rolls Royce. Those were the days. Anyway, I had these rooms in Remuera Road, and I was a hypnotherapist. And along came this dude with a parrot. And he wanted to reduce his anxiety and give himself more options. At least that was the way I framed it up. He was not quite so articulate. Lord, God, send me articulate, attractive and well-motivated clients, please. And I'll be a shut-up therapist. Anyway, you take what you can get, and in came this guy with a parrot, for Christ's sake. Okay, well, we worked. And I have to say, he worked hard. And there was never any problem about paying the fee. And he wanted to get rid of the parrot, but he couldn't. Basically, if he didn't have the parrot whispering in his ear, watch out, be careful, you can't do that. No, careful, you silly. God, you're stupid. That sort of shit. He got really anxious. He recognised that what the parrot was saying and the program that he had was not terribly useful, and he would dearly love to be able to work on that and get on with his life without that shit. But he got so anxious. He didn't have the parrot whispering in his ear or screeching in his ear, but he couldn't function. So when we boiled down after some preliminary skirmishing to what he wanted to get to the stage where he could get rid of the parrot. Well, these days we've got phones and voice recorders and God alone knows what. In those days they didn't even have Walkmans. They didn't even have the Sony Walkman. What they did have was a thing called a dictaphone. It had little tapes. We got a mini dictaphone from the States. He had to write away. It took about 3 bloody months to arrive, and in the meantime I saw him once a week and we worked, and the parrot perched on his shoulder. And he lay back in my lazy boy chair and ultimately went into a very deep trance. The parrot sat on his shoulder, and we worked. But eventually this dictaphone package arrived, and it had batteries you had to put in it. It wasn't rechargeable, so what have you, and the batteries didn't last all that long, but you could make a recording and you could play it back. So it was designed for business, so the boss doesn't get the secretary to come in and take dictation anymore. Pleasure fires at him or whatever, because in those days, of course, the boss was male and the secretaries were female. But the world, thank goodness, has changed. But in those days, that's how it was. The boss used the dictaphone and take a letter to, and the secretary would then be able to play it with her little headphone thingies while she typed, and take a letter in, the boss would sign it, and off it would go in the mail. As I say, the world's changed. So, we got the dictaphone. And over a period of a couple of weeks, we got everything the parrot habitually said to Noel. Watch out, be careful, all that stuff. So we had it on the dictaphone, we had it on tape. I didn't tell Noel what it was going to do. newspaper and prepared that. I got some brown paper, because in those days that's what you wrap parcels in, and I had sellotape and string. I also had the name and address of a taxidermist down New North Road, because we were in Newmarket. So Noel and the parrot arrived. Oh, and the other thing I'd got was a stick, about 18 inches long, or so wide, so thick, made of manuka actually. The very same stuff that makes manuka honey. But that's a different story again too. Gosh, I've got lots of stories. Anyway, I got Noel relaxing and the lazy boy and the parrot perched on his shoulder. And after he was in a very deep trance, I snuck up behind him with the stick and I whacked the parrot across the back of the head. And some joke about many-sided figures called a polygon, and that poly was bloody gone. Fell off his shoulder, Noel half woke up. I grabbed the parrot up off the floor. Dead as a dono. Smashed the back of its skull. If you've heard of Braswell, probably, but that's enough. Whatever. So I wrapped the parrot in newspaper. Wrapped the newspaper in brown paper. Tied it up with sellotape. Woke Noel up. He's coming round anyway by then. Woke him up, gave him the name and address of the taxidermist, and said, "You've got some choices now, buddy. You can have the parrot stuffed, and I think you ought to do that, because that parrot's been around for a long time. And when you need to hear, 'Watch out, be careful,' and all that shit, you've got it there on the dictaphone, you can play it. So you don't have to be anxious. Now you've got some choices. You can take the parrot, you can try putting it back under your high hat. When you want a parade, you can keep it on your shoulders stuffed when you do your pirate shit. All the time, you've got the little dictaphone. You can play the stuff if you want to. But you might find," and here I move my voice into embedded commands, "you might find that as time goes on, you play it less and less and less. And eventually, you might get to the stage where you don't need to play it at all, and you can simply get on with the rest of your life. Would you pay the receptionist on your way out, please?" It was $12 in those days. Prices were different. Well, Noel went away and he did pay the receptionist. And from time to time I heard stories about this guy who was wandering around the place in a high hat. Same guy was dressing up as a pirate with a parrot, still doing kids' parties. Don't know whether he was still doing sex with people who wanted to pay for a bit of kink or not. Don't know about that stuff. Well, I haven't seen Noel since, and that was a really, really long time ago. And that's the end of the story for tonight. And in due course, this, along with a whole load of other stories, are going to appear either on YouTube or in a podcast or God knows where. But they'll be somewhere. They will appear somewhere. Of that, I promise you. And good night.